because, as I often say, there is something in the IRA for everyone. For every person in this room, as a consumer, as a homeowner, as an employee, as an employer, as a person affiliated with organizations and other entities. There is something in this bill for you. I also often say there is something that you can do. So this is not the type of legislation that is about the actions other folks will take. This is very much a piece of legislation that is about the actions that all of us can take. And so if there is a takeaway, because we'll cover a lot of ground, if there's a takeaway, that takeaway ought to be there's something in this bill for you, and there's something you can do leveraging this bill. So this is the quick disclaimer that my colleagues at the IRS forced me to include in all of my presentations. You know, we set the tax rules, but we are not your tax advisor. So if there's ever any doubt, consult somebody, enlist somebody that has tax professional in their title. But this information will be helpful, so hopefully you can listen while you eat. So, top line. The Inflation Reduction Act is the largest investment this country has ever made in clean energy and climate action. It is a truly significant piece of legislation. The initial estimates all indicated that nearly $400 billion would flow from this piece of legislation. So we're talking about a significant amount of money. The majority of that $400 billion will flow in the form of tax incentives. So that has put my agency, the Treasury Department, at the center of the action because we administer the tax code with the IRS. But notably, it also, again, puts each and every one of you at the center of the action. Because the interesting thing about tax incentives, they don't do anything unless you take action. So they're effectively a sort of conditional benefit. You make a decision, you take an action, and the federal government supports you financially in taking that action. But if you don't move, the tax incentives don't do anything at all. So we're very much in this together. So the theme, climate and democracy is pretty appropriate here. Because in the same way that democracy is a collective form of government, this battle, this fight to advance the clean energy transition, leveraging this piece of legislation, will also necessarily need to be a collective exercise. So, sticking on this theme, the big takeaway point, that there's something in this bill for everyone, is genuinely true. I was in North Carolina a couple of weeks ago, and Wake Tech, a community college, was talking about a geothermal heat pump system that they've installed to provide heating and cooling to several buildings around campus. So there's something in this bill if you're a college or a university. There's something in this bill if you're a utility company. There's something in this bill for you if you have a long commute to work every day. There's something in this bill for everyone. Again, hold on to that takeaway point, and I'll try to walk you through what some of those individual pieces are, because you may or may not see every angle that may be applicable to you. So I'll start here on consumers. What you have listed here are a handful of provisions woven into the Inflation Reduction Act that in one way or another allow you to tap into federal resources as you make home upgrades, EV purchases, clean energy investments, etc., etc. I was in Raleigh, as I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, and I visited the home of Vicki and Ted Atkinson. I visited their home because they are one of the many American households that have already leveraged these benefits. I went with them down into the crawl space underneath their home and checked out their new heat pump water heater. One of the things you can do is you can have us, the federal government, partially cover the cost of a heat pump water heater. So that's great because that heat pump water heater costs you less than the ticket price. It's also great because heat pump water heaters use significantly less energy on an ongoing basis than traditional electric water heaters. So you win at the time of purchase, you win when you file your taxes, and you also win month after month after month after month because your utility bill is necessarily lower. So you as a consumer, you as a homeowner, you should work to make sure you understand this spectrum of benefits, this spectrum of incentives, because there will may be an upgrade you'd like to make that, again, the federal government will cover a portion of the benefit of. One of the keys here, though, is getting the word out. We did a press release at Treasury maybe a month ago showing that for the 2023 calendar year, more than 3.4 million households tapped into the home energy incentives that are covered at the top of this slide. So that's a lot of families. And those families were able to secure more than $8.4 billion in immediate savings. So you add up the totals of all of the tax credit claims they were able to make, and you're talking about a meaningful amount of money. But my strong sense is that we can take those numbers significantly higher if we do a better job of getting the word out. Because every time you do a poll, we find out that maybe 40%, 45% of Americans know these incentives exist. My good friend Raina, who I said in the breakout session with earlier, she noted as we started talking about some of these benefits that she wasn't quite sure what we were talking about. There are a lot of people around the country in exactly that same situation. So not only is that a loss for them individually, but that's a loss for us as a country, that's a loss for us as a planet, because we kind of sort of need to move on these issues. What I'm trying to do here is capture some of the benefits, because what I've found as I've traveled around the country is people think about these decision points in lots of different ways. For many people, it's a clean, direct question of wanting and needing to reduce the total on their monthly utility bill. There's a path to doing that through this incentive framework, but there are other considerations that may animate your decision as well. So for instance, if you move from a gas stove to an induction stove, you may lower the chances your child ends up with asthma. It's a big deal. For solar with battery installations, on crazy days like this one, when there's a decent chance power goes out, if you have solar on a roof and a battery in the back, your lights may stay on as the lights of everyone else on your block don't. So there are a range of different benefits that you want to think about, or that you might think about as you contemplate some of the decisions you can make under this framework. So that's consumers. But again, there's something in the Inflation Reduction Act for everybody. This slide references some of the benefits and incentives that are relevant to nonprofits, and I framed it as nonprofits because we're obviously doing this event at a church. But these provisions are applicable to a broad cross-section of tax-exempt entities. And that is also a big deal, which I'll come back to in half a second. But when I got here yesterday, one of the things I had the pleasure to do was visit Oakhurst Presbyterian Church in Decatur. They have recently gotten solar installed, and so I stopped by to check out their solar installation and also learn a little bit about how the tax credit process has gone for them thus far, because we're trying to make it better and more accessible to people over time. And they were generally happy, and one of the things they were happy about, they ended up showing me. They pulled out a handful of their recent utility bills, and they showed me a utility bill from 3 months back, where the total at the bottom of the page was $1,400. Then they showed me the utility bill from last month, The total at the bottom of that page was $46. So, it is not necessarily the case that every solar installation will completely eliminate your utility bill, but the ability, the capacity, the possibility is there. So I thought I'd share that anecdote because there are genuinely meaningful opportunities for energy cost savings that are a clean energy installation away. So I wanted to very much foot stomp that point. The last note I'll make here is not only are there a range of credits that may be relevant, but the Inflation Reduction Act integrated a handful of what we call bonus credits because we wanted to go the extra mile in making sure that this clean energy transition was inclusive. And so for projects or investments that are occurring in low-income communities, or what we generally call energy communities, so for instance an old coal town, or a place where the fossil fuel industry has historically been the driver of the local economy, you can essentially increase the size of your credit by citing projects in those geographies. And so it's another important thematic that's worth lifting up. Again, with all of these decision points, I think it would be really helpful to highlight the range of diverse benefits that you might be able to tap into. This picture is a picture of Watts Willowbrook Church out in Compton, California. They recently flipped the switch and turned their solar installation on. And one of the themes I've heard from nonprofits over and over again is captured in that third bullet. If you do one of these projects and you do indeed save money, that's about the climate, that's about clean energy, but it's also in some ways about your core mission. If you're running a child care facility because the thing you care about the most in the world is child care, if you end up saving money through one of these projects, perhaps that allows you to admit more children. Maybe that allows you to expand your staff. Maybe that allows you to layer on additional programming so you can advance your core mission more effectively or at a broader scale. And so thinking about all of the potential knock-on effects that may come along with these decisions is also useful. Last point in this sort of second section, because I think people may have missed this. Many of the tax incentives that are in the Inflation Reduction Act pre-existed the Inflation Reduction Act. They weren't brand new. Some of them were modified in certain ways or expanded, and all of them were extended out another 10 years, which was very important. But another really important thing that happened is that the direct pay or elective pay provision was woven into the bill. And what that allowed us to do was bring tax-exempt entities to the party. So historically, tax credits weren't a very big deal for tax-exempt entities. If you don't pay federal income taxes, what are you going to do with a tax credit? You don't have taxes to offset. You know, the way a tax credit works is you may owe the government $30, you get a $5 tax credit, so you send the government $25. All of that necessarily presupposes that you owe taxes in the first place. So if you're a tribal government or a local government, a state government, a church, a child care facility, a health clinic, a broad range of entities that don't regularly pay federal income taxes, you weren't part of the tax credit conversation. That changed in a really meaningful way in the IRA through the direct pay tool. And so what happens now is if you're one of those entities and you follow the process that we've laid out, you receive a tax-free cash payment in the exact amount of what the tax credit might otherwise be. So again, if you are a church and you do a $100,000 geothermal heat pump installation, and you qualify for a 40% tax credit, what happens is you submit your taxes and the IRS sends you a check for $40,000, which can be helpful. And so, you know, one of the great joys that I'm looking forward to in the coming weeks is we're getting to that period where for calendar year 2023, direct pay claimants are starting to receive their checks in the mail. And there's just nothing better than getting that photo in your inbox of a nonprofit institution holding up their IRS check that essentially, you know, took this journey to its sort of happy concluding moment. And so, again, this is another place where there's a lot of opportunity, but more than anything, we need to get awareness up, we need to get understanding up, we need to set more precedent, because the more and more people do this, the more and more examples we have out there for others to follow. Last stop I'll make, housing is an issue that is being talked about with increasing amounts of intensity, principally because of the affordability crisis that we're dealing with. So climate change is obviously a big challenge that we face as a people, but housing affordability is too. And I think there's a nice intersection between climate, mitigation and affordability that you can get at through some of the tax incentives that are relevant to housing developers and building owners. And again, as time passes, more and more entities are recognizing and taking advantage of these opportunities. So I called recently with an organization called POA that's based in Massachusetts who does affordable housing projects leveraging the low-income housing tax credit in various parts of the country. And they have found that in doing their multifamily developments, it is actually hard to rationalize not also leveraging the investment tax credit to install solar, because there are interesting ways in which different tax credits can be combined and stacked in a way that multiplies the benefit that ends up flowing from the federal government. So they've essentially established a new default, that is, they will install solar every time they do a new LIHTC development. Similarly, we had a conversation with Beazer Homes recently. They do a lot of single-family development around the country. 45L, which is a tax credit that relates to certain energy efficiency measures. So these are more efficient HVAC systems. This is improved insulation. These are better windows and doors and air sealing. If you meet a particular standard that is established by my colleagues at EPA and BOE, there's a tax credit benefit that you can tap into. Beazer's done this work, and they've decided that their default is every single family home they build will hit the 45L standard because that's a good thing for the planet, but with big companies like this, you also know that it's a good thing for the bottom line too. And so, part of what we're trying to do is sort of get people to that place in a systematic manner. For lots of years, people talked about, climate change action, and they'd say, you can spend a little extra money and you can save the planet. And saving the planet is important, so you actually may want to spend more money to do that. But it's even better if you can spend a little less money and also save the planet. And, we haven't gotten this framework perfectly yet, but all of these provisions, this tax credit framework is designed to try to get more and more people in that sweet spot of saving the planet and also saving some money. So again, as we try to tackle the housing affordability challenge, know that there's a potential intersection with our response to the climate crisis that is important to, that is very important to lift up. As I wind down, because one of the things we want to try to do is take a few questions before we run out of time. The tax incentives, as noted earlier, are the largest part of the Inflation Reduction Act, at least from a monetary perspective, but it is worth noting that there are other pieces of the legislation that may also be relevant to you or entities that you are affiliated with. one notable piece is the greenhouse gas reduction fund. When you think about the GGRF, what you should essentially think about is lower cost financing. So again, getting at this question of making these projects financially viable for entities, no matter who they are, no matter where they are, the GGRF has been designed to systematically provide lower cost financing that helps people get to yes on some of these projects, especially in underserved communities where the dollar calculus is a little tighter. There are also a number of grant programs that are administered by DOE and EPA. I mentioned one in particular, the Community Change Grants program. And those are pieces of the puzzle that you may also want to familiarize yourself with because they may be relevant to you depending on what entity you're representing at that time. On the subject of grants, it is also worth flagging that in most cases, there's nothing preventing you from combining grants and tax credits. So some of the best stories you hear are when people find that sort of great point of synergy where they're weaving together several different incentives to truly make some of these decisions in a sort of no-brainer.
Ron, could you go back one slide, please?
I can.
To that. Okay.
This one? Sorry.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Not a problem. So, that's essentially it for the presentation, and hopefully we'll have a few minutes for a few questions. But again, the takeaway point is the same thing we started with. Irrespective of who you are, again, individual consumer, family, homeowner, etc., employer, small business, employee at a utility company, there is something in this legislation for you. We may need to work together to make sure we unpack exactly what your lane is, and we're going to try to do as much as we can to collaborate with folks on that. But don't, please be disabused of any sort of assumption or notion that this piece of legislation does not have something in it for you. So that concludes the slides, and and at least until Amanda does the loud bell thing, we'll keep talking.
You still have some time.
Okay, awesome. So, a few questions. And maybe state, because I know this is a really unique, diverse group, do name and principal affiliation so I can get a sense of where the question may be coming from.
Danny Johnson at Atlanta Regional Commission.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about the timing when these, when the deadlines are for the whole thing, or is it different deadlines for different?
So on the tax credits, there are a couple of things that are worth noting. One, most of these tax credits have been extended either indefinitely or for a 10-year period that will take you through 2032. So there are lots of good reasons that we've highlighted why you might want to do this tomorrow. But as a technical matter, the way the legislation is crafted, you have another 8 years to make a decision. For the tax incentives, by definition, you are tapping into those when you submit your taxes. So as an individual, every April, mid-April, as a business entity, every sort of mid-May, unless you've requested an extension. And that tax credit relates to an action that's taken place the prior year. So Oakhurst Presbyterian, for instance, they've installed a solar installation and they turned it on 2 months ago. So when they submit their tax forms next May, that's when they will submit the final collection of information that will unlock that check from the IRS that we spoke about before. So let me know if that's responsive, but we're essentially working on a tax cycle with the tax incentives. The grants may work differently. I mentioned briefly some of the rebate programs that are being administered by DOE. By definition, those rebate programs are upfront amounts. So with the rebates, you're simply getting those at point of sale. One distinction between the rebate programs and the tax credits. The rebate programs are like grant programs generally. There's a fixed amount, and you can keep going back to that well until that fixed amount expires. With most of these tax incentives, they're essentially uncapped. So if you check the requisite boxes, the money will be there for you, and that's also sort of a nice feature, a nice piece of the plan. Other questions?
Monica Thornton, I'm with TNC. I'm asking on behalf of my Asian parents and other folks who don't have maybe information. Like, what are you doing to make sure that taxpayers understand these incentives and know how to take advantage of it? Like, for instance, on television all day, along with political ads, we're here to replace your windows. And are those vendors being educated so that they can help the buyer kind of understand what that opportunity is? And are the tax preparers also being educated so that they can advise you, did you replace your windows this year when you're doing that? So just want to know more about your education process.
It's an excellent question. The simple answer is, any and everything we can do. It is a real challenge. The prior panel discussion talked a little bit about news and social media and the sort of information landscape and how much harder it is today to get information out than it was, 50 years ago when Walter Cronkite spoke to, most everybody at the same time. It is a real challenge, and I made the real point earlier that we are having a really difficult time getting this information to folks, but we're trying a bunch of things. One is we spend a lot of time on the road in places like this, not only because presumably everybody here will leave the room knowing a little bit about these, but also because I'm hoping that you will become amplifiers and microphones within your sort of circles and talk to people within your circles. We're also doing things that you might suspect. The various contractor and home energy contractor trade associations, we've engaged with them, we've provided them information. You've seen good examples of that being integrated. I've talked to many a contractor that the first conversation they have is, hey, homeowner, you can make whatever decision you want to about your HVAC system, but I'd like to let you know that these options may come with a tax credit or a rebate, and here's some information from the IRS or from the Treasury Department that can provide a little bit more information here. There are lots of advocacy and outreach organizations. Interfaith Power and Light, for instance, has been a true leader in getting this information to churches, and because especially the nonprofits that have not historically had a lot of reason to pay attention to this part of the IRS sort of ecosystem, you really need to meet them where they are and sort of knock on the door a handful of times. So there's engagement there. We've worked with organizations like the League of Conservation Voters that has literally done door-knocking canvases in states all across the country. We've engaged with community-based lenders because with a lot of these types of investments, it may be the case that the federal government will cover 30%, 40%, 50%. There's still another 50%, 60%, 70%. That might necessitate you taking out a loan, and so you end up engaging your lender. If you engage your lender, we want them to be equipped with all of this information so they can provide it to you and let you know that whatever you were thinking this was going to cost, it'll cost some amount lower than that. So those are illustrative examples. We've tried quite a many things, and we'll keep sort of kicking the door as much as we can.
Oh, there has to be one more. For the state of Georgia,
You've given us a month already.
Everyone else in that room can do that.
this is too valuable. This is, so, one hat I wear is Georgia Cities Foundation. I'm Laura Carey. 536 cities and main streets in Georgia. And there's an incredible ecology of planning, urban design, and so forth. And the notion of a resilient hub in each of those to accelerate awareness, but also execution. Also, Atlanta Regional Commission has the LCI, Political Centers Initiative, where they spend a lot of planning credits, and to put a resilient hub in the center of this. So I'm curious how y'all are able to work with an NPO, Metropolitan Planning Association, on these hubs and these town centers and streets, and with the state Department of Community Affairs, for example.
Yeah, so a couple of things. One, we sort of systematically look for good entry points for talking to people at scale. So showing up at the National Governors Association convenings, the National League of Cities. There are, any number of entities that can help you reach governmental entities, either state level or local level. We show up in those places. For lower capacity governments that need help in some ways at an even greater level, I have a colleague, David Eichenthal, who literally spends his life on the road visiting smaller towns, smaller communities, trying to help them connect the dots and think through the numbers and see if some of these pieces can fit into their urban planning process in an effective and efficient way. So it's the same, it's the same type of exercise that we're doing for consumers or for housing developers, just through different channels. Last note I'll make, resiliency hubs are an interesting dynamic. For folks not familiar with that, it's a concept that is bubbled up that in most cases leverages solar plus battery storage to create entities, organizations, institutions within communities where people can come together in times of extreme weather, in times of power outages. And it can be really important for any number of reasons, just to keep people safe, to give people a place where they can keep their medicine refrigerated, the list goes on and on and on. We've seen lots of interesting examples bubble up for how this is being done. I'll mention just one and then I'll close. I was out in Seattle 3 weeks ago and I visited a church in Vashon, on Vashon Island. And that church ended up doing solar and battery, got it done really economically because they were able to combine a grant with a tax credit they were paying, and now they're producing essentially all of their energy for free. Because of that, in some ways they've become this natural hub within the community, because when you have that power source, it actually works better if you have a more consistent load. It's not a great thing if you're just using the building on Sunday and Saturday and Wednesday. And so over time, they have become this sort of centerpiece for the community. So the local food bank has moved its operations on site there. There are a handful of adult education courses that are also currently being taught from their facilities. During the summer, they're producing free lunches for students who rely upon those lunches during the school year out of those facilities. And for all of those other partner entities, they can come onto those facilities at a reduced rent rate because they're not splitting the cost of energy. The energy has become free. And so you've seen these nice dynamics bubble up like that. And to the point of your initial question, the next time there's a power outage in this area, people will naturally converge on that building and find safety and refuge until things are a little laid out. So hopefully that's been helpful. This has been a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.